My talk is entitled Parallel Silk Road. And as you might know, Silk Road is the most ancient Euro-Asian continental bridge that's linking the west and the east parts of the continent. And as I read from the catalog conference, I'm the only foreigner and the people from the eastern part of the continent. So I customized this topic, Silk Road, because I'm supposed to talk about how to move on Russia. So Silk Road is one of the potential solution push on not only on Russia but also on China. And actually, China is a country in urbanization, and I'm the founder of a magazine called Urban China. And China, in the previous 30 years, the whole country has witnessed the urbanization rate from no more than 20% to now almost 50%. And in the coming 20 years, there are going to be 20 million rural population being urbanized every year. And finally, there are 400 million peasants migrating into the city in 20 years. So the basic process of this urbanization actually starts from the coastline, which is the frontier between the land and the sea, to the hinterland. And under the system, what we call whole nation support in the regional economy. And this system is actually supposed to be one of the most important advantage in the centralized system, in which Russia used to use that in the planned economy. And you can see actually this experiment started with a series of special economic zones in South China, which is very close to Hong Kong, in 1980s. And then in 1990s, it moved up to the East China along the coastline. And then in 2000, moved up to even North China. And then recently, China has launched its 12 5-year plan. The 5-year plan is a tradition invented by Soviet Union, and China is still one of the countries still using this kind of instrument to actually deploy the plan in the market economy. And the basic principle of the 12 5-year plan is actually switching from the exportation-oriented economy to the domestic demand, which has actually resulted in a spatial structure originally focused on the coastline and now more oriented to the hinterland. That is why today I'm very happy to be here, away from the axis between Moscow and St. Petersburg in the hinterland of Russia. And that is actually an opportunity to compare the different development model between China and Russia. In China, we have a geography line, which is called Aihui Chengchong line. And this line actually divided the whole territory into two equal parts. However, the population distribution in these two equal parts is very different. In the northwest of China here, there are only 6% of population living in over 57% of the land. And in the southeast part of the territory, there are over 94% of population living in the 43% of the land. I actually find a very similar line demarcating the whole territory of Russia here, but I cannot find the demography map of Russia by far, so I use the USSR map here. And you can find out this line demarcating or dividing the whole territory into two parts. And I guess over 90% of population living in the west and less than 10% population living in the east. But I cannot find a statistic by far, but you can actually support me. And then actually there's a complementary structure between these two parts, which I called the complementary structure between the more and the less. And then the real similarity between these two maps is actually a similarity between the biggest land power in the world. And the land power, one of the essential feature or quality of land power is that a land power has to dealing with a massive amount of land that is supposed to be or apparently useless. And the successfulness of this management depends on how successful it can set up a complementary structure between the more and the less, between the more populated area with the less attractive or the less livable places. However, we can also say the less is more, because everybody knows that in Siberia or the Far East, actually we can find more resources over there. It is also true in China, we can find more resources in the northwest of China. And more importantly, the last part of these two territories also provide the potential more important geopolitical locations. So in the eastern part of Russia, it's actually providing the connection to the two ends of the Eurasian continent, and also provides outlet to the Pacific Ocean, and also the access to the North Pole. So a very parallel universe here in China is that it provides a gateway of the Silk Road to the west of the continent, and also the access to the third pole. And third pole is actually a term in China which means the Himalaya mountains. And it's also very cold, it's very high, and actually it's supposed to be the Noah's Ark if there is a coming flood in the future. And in between this, more or less, you can find also a parallel corridor, a natural corridor linking the two parts of the territory. And this corridor is called Trans-Siberia Corridor, and this corridor is called Heshi Corridor. So very similar to each other. And then before we understand, I call these two corridors parallel Silk Road, by the way. This is actually our topic today. And then before we start to compare the two parallel Silk Roads, we have to understand the mechanism of the transport infrastructure. So basically, transport infrastructure is the linkage between the 2 points that is composed by the supply of one thing and the demand of another. And then the infrastructure basically link the 2 points and communicating the supply and the demand in between each other. And then that is how a complementary structure is set up. And then every infrastructure has to choose a specific passage. And those locations that are closer to this passage actually become more important simply because it's closer to the supply and the demand complementary structure and the communication. And then the potential value of the locations of this, location of this point has been changed. A very typical example is that the historical Silk Road between the east end of the continent, the west end of the continent, between China and Europe, actually benefit a lot of intermediators, including the Central Asia and the Middle East. However, there are also competition of the transport infrastructure. Then the competition actually lies in all the factors, including the distance, speed, volume, and price and stability. If the second infrastructure can prove itself, can provide a shorter distance and faster speed and greater volume and cheaper price and better stability, and then another older infrastructure is going to be marginalized. And then the locations and the cities along the older infrastructure is going to be shrinking. And this also happened in history when the maritime technology is developed and the maritime Silk Road was developed, and the Central Asia, Middle East has been marginalized. And this competition of the Silk Road is actually a competition between the two powers, the land power and the sea power. And this is a map to understand how the sea power provides a totally different pattern of the world, of the management of the territory. Actually, the British Empire, British colonial empire, is the biggest collector of all the islands. And in between all these islands, you can see nothing. You can see nowhere. And then there are much less responsibility and much less effort in managing all these different territory. But you can imagine there are greater responsibility and effort in managing all the complicated borderline and neighborhoods relationship, diplomatics on the land power. And then the Cold War, as we understand, can be understood again as the war between the land power and the sea power. Here you can see the Soviet Union is actually the biggest land power in the world, linking the two ends of the continent. And the United States is the biggest sea power in the world, linking the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean in the world. However, the Soviet Union actually became the enemy of the ex-friends, which is British in the Second World War. And the United States actually became the friend of its ex-enemy in the eastern part of Eurasian continent, which is Japan. And then these two gateways actually has a blockage to this land power. And finally, the United States became the friend of ex-enemy China. And finally, Soviet Union has to spend much more budget and expense in fighting and competing against the sea power and lost the Cold War. So if the infrastructure is one important factor in changing the potential value of the location, the technology of the infrastructure actually changed the primacy of the infrastructure. So this technology here, recently developed in China, actually prove there is a possibility in revising the importance or dominance of the land power and sea power. So recently, the average operating speed of the high-speed railway in China has reached up to 350 kilometers per hour, and the highest speed has reached up to 487 kilometers per hour, which is very close to the flight. And then actually we can see there's a possibility that the land power or the infrastructure across the continent through the land power can be revived. And you can imagine there's a potential vision of the communication between the two ends of the continent in the future, that from London to Beijing, you can take only 48 hours by the high-speed railway. And you can also imagine there are a lot of historical important sites and cities and civilizations being revived because of this revival of the continental transportation by high-speed railway. That is why Kazakhstan, all the STAN countries are so interested in developing this new technology. And the president of Kazakhstan here is looking at the potential future led by the high-speed railway. Many developing countries, even developed countries, are very interested in high-speed railway. However, they are very bored by the fact that they are in a shortage of the money. However, if we take the fact that China has the biggest foreign currency or foreign exchange reserve in the world, and by 2006 it's 1 trillion, by 2009 it's 2 trillion, and only by the end of last month it's 3 trillion. And the head of the Central Bank of China actually noticed that this actually exceeds our real demand in domestic investment, which means that China is going to invest more and more US dollars in this era of the deflation, the global deflation and the devaluation of the US dollars in the foreign countries, especially in the foreign infrastructure constructions. So finally, we're coming back to our topic about the parallel Silk Road. Since there's historical parallel Silk Road, there is a new parallel Silk Road. One here below is through China to Central Asia, to Middle East, and to Turkey, to East Europe. Another one is going directly through the whole territory of Russia. However, the pattern of the two Silk Roads is also very different. The one above, through Russia, is actually dominated by a single political entity, but the one below actually goes through different entities that are more politically unstable. So we can imagine the diagram can be redrawn like this. The first one is actually going through Russia, and the second one goes through a lot of different entities. And actually, that also, this unification and the diversification of the administration also resulted in a different situation of the distribution of the profit, of the interest, which finally resulted in the different development model in the different regions here. That is also another unstable factor of the different model of the Silk Road and competition between the Silk Roads. And historically, the two Silk Roads in Russia and in China are generated by the different domestic demand in making the two ends of the empire, land power, complementary. But we can imagine a new complementary structure that is more international, regional collaboration based. So in between the less territory of Russia and the more territory of China, in between the more territory of Russia and the less territory of China, there can be potential hubs located here in the Far East, in between the northeast of China and the Far East of Russia. In between here in Russia, between Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and the northwest of China, there can be the potential hubs for the future collaboration between the parallel Silk Roads. Thank you.
Thank you.